I was given instructions as to how to turn off lights and how to put microphones on, and I'm not very good at it. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay. I want to thank Geraldine Ford's Isais. It's really quite an honor to be here today. Thank you very much. This is a fantastic building, and this is a great school of architecture, so I'm really honored to be here today. Now, I have to confess that I struggled to put the lecture together. It's the second time I give this lecture. I just gave it at UCLA a week ago. So it's very fresh. And the reason I struggle is in part because as a dean, I get to see great lectures, but also in part because in my mind, the practice of architecture seems to be an all-time low. I think that there is, on the one hand, a dramatic lack of interest in architecture as a form of cultural expression. And on the other hand, I see contemporary architectural discourse as disseminating what I consider two opposing thoughts, or seemingly, two thoughts that are seemingly opposites. On the one hand, there are those that exalt technology as the end-all of architecture, be it sustainability, be it digital technology, being digital fabrication, or the software du jour. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are some that argue for social consciousness, almost as a form of architectural moral compass. I call this architect a superhero, as if architecture had the power to really change the world. Now, that's not to say that I believe that architecture is powerless or ineffectual, or that I think that architecture is devoid of political content. But I do think that in the last few years, by presenting these as extreme opposites, I do think that this conundrum has made practice not only intellectually sterile, but in some circles, architectural practice is now being presented almost as if it's evil, as if architectural practice was not difficult enough. Now, as I said before, I'm the dean of a large public school, and as such, I have been very fortunate in the last few years to welcome to the college practitioners and thinkers that are grappling with the same issues. And I have to confess, I tend to gravitate towards those practitioners that have held on to an engagement with building, and I still believe that building has power. I tend to gravitate towards those practitioners that master technology but don't make a big deal out of it. And I tend, at the end of the day, to gravitate towards I tend to align myself towards those practitioners that don't wear social responsibility in their sleeve as if that makes them better than other architects. And ultimately, I think that I align myself with those who think of form and space as the business of architecture. There's been 3 lectures at the college in the last couple of years that have really affected my thinking lately, and I want to discuss them just for a few minutes before I actually proceed with the work. One was a lecture by Max Coggin and Meryl Elam, and perhaps they gave the same lecture here, but they were talking about the ugly fool. And what was amazing about the lecture is that they recuperated aesthetics as a preoccupation for architecture, but did it in a completely fresh and new way. And they presented the pretty as a dead end. And that, of course, created a certain sense of panic for me, because I have always thought of the work that I aspire to do as somehow being pretty. And then Michael Hayes gave an interesting lecture in which he very much went to the heart of the current predicament in architecture, the dance of architecture. And he focused on issues of sustainability, but not from a technological point of view, more as a point of reference for effects in buildings. And that, in my mind, can open up a different way of looking at the relationship between architecture and the environment in ways that you can look at traces throughout history that can be revived, revitalized, and perhaps picked up once again. And then finally, we were very fortunate that Sylvia Levin came to the college the day that her book hit the bookstores, Kissing Architecture. Looking at the relationship today between large art installations and buildings, and the potential for that renewed relationship between art and architecture as a way of revitalizing building today. So I'm going to show a series of projects, some of them new, some of them not so new, as a way of somehow taking stock of this moment in time for me and my practice. It is no secret that I have been obsessed with materials and methods of construction, and that I have been obsessed with taking the common and trying to translate it into something perhaps new. And if you ask me to give a definition for architecture, I would say that architecture is the search for the new, and that at the heart of architecture is a certain idea of innovation, even if it's just something as simple as making a brick wall seem animate. Now, it's interesting that this preoccupation with materiality has always, in my work, been associated with movement, even when things, of course, are very static. The number of times that I have been asked if this wall actually moves, and how did I get it to move, and how do I get brick to actually expand and contract, for me has been actually quite funny. But it is true that at the heart of a lot of the material manipulations has been this notion of variation, or the seeming idea of variation that in turn then creates a certain sense of objects not being static and buildings not being static. Whether it is installations in architecture schools, like this installation that I did at Georgia Tech when I was teaching there, or at Harvard Graduate School of Design, be it new materials, or in this case, it was the first time that I explored the use of a robotic arm for the fabrication of, for the manipulation of stone to make it semi-transparent. Some of the research that I've done in academia, I have brought into museum spaces. This is an installation at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, but also very much and directly, squarely into practice. I never thought of installations as ends of themselves. I always thought of them as steps towards the everyday and the mundane of practice. So historically, while I've been obsessed with the notion of aggregation, I have also tried to take a step back and be self-critical. So in this particular project, I was thinking of Greg Lynn's critique of intricacy of aggregation, and how perhaps one should work with the notion of the smooth surface. So instead, my obsession moved to hiding joints, eliminating joints, and eliminating all of the kinds of junk that one sees in ceilings. If you look up, you will see lights, you will see diffusers, you will see sprinkler heads, you will see all of this stuff that we have to contend with in ceilings above our heads. So in this particular project, I decided to line them all up and place them within a 3.5-inch gap. So that gap actually holds all of the mechanical systems that were required for the project, and even things like video cameras and microphones. And then the resulting figure was not necessarily a certain expressionistic desire on our part, but instead simply the connecting of the dots of what was optimal from the point of view of a mechanical consultant. But of course, the reality is that the smooth does not exist. and that at the end, even if you're trying to hide joints, the joints are actually there, and that architecture is made out of components, even if you eradicate their presence. This line of inquiry has been definitely a thread within the work, and it's taken different variations and different life depending on the project, from high budgets to very low. So the issue of skinning, how to apply a surface to a building, is something that I think is important for architecture, and is definitely important today, when in many instances the skin of the building is all we get to do. So when confronted with recladding this gas station in Los Angeles, the cladding then took different morphologies, different shapes, different sizes, including blowing up enough in order to house a program, like the program where you pay for your gas, but also flexible enough to distort depending on the forces of the site, be it simply the end of the site, the extension of a canopy to protect the cars from the weather, or the pressure of a pre-existing billboard sign. So the relationship between architecture and natural phenomena, I think, makes a very fertile ground for exploring different venues for architecture. This is a scene from Fargo, the movie Fargo, and I think it depicts really well the context for a project that we did for the General Services Administration in Madawaska, Maine. Basically, it's a space where snow is your main material, and architecture, in a way, needs to be reconceived as a way of holding that snow. So when we were asked to design the building, the guidelines of the General Services Administration place a limit on the height of the building of 12 feet. The slope is quite dramatic over the length of the building. And then the canopies then have a height restriction of 16. So we decided to work with a project that blended the differences in height, but also became a container for the snow that we expect will fall over the course of the year. So the roof of the building and the canopy of the and the canopy for the check-in of the cars became then a morphology that then distorted from one to the next. So these references between canopy and different kind of natural phenomena is something that I'm interested in, and that becomes then an alibi for distorting conventional structural systems. So the idea that you take a particular typology and then you exaggerate it is very much one of the techniques that I think is very much at the fingertips of an architect. So for instance, when designing this cultural center in Antwerp, in Belgium, we very much took as a cue the presence of the zoo right next to the complex. So as a result, our dealing with the amphitheater, with the concert hall, was very, very different because of its proximity to the zoo. The program of the building generated a body that is then encased within the building itself. And this kind of referencing then affected the way that we consider the structural system, the way that we consider the surfaces, and the way that we consider the program. So as a result, the underbelly of the theater is no longer just the underbelly of architecture. But instead, we attempt to make references to other kinds of underbellies. So rather than making reference to a landscape, as in the case of the previous colonnade the previous loggia that I showed, in this case, really a very physical bodily landscape, not unlike the kinds of bodies that you will find in the zoo. Now, this more remote reference of the underbelly then acquire a more immediate acquire a more immediate presence when dealing with the surfaces of the auditorium itself. For acoustical reasons, we had to make the surfaces trabeated with a lot of texture as a way of bouncing the sound. And then we chose, in a very abstract but figurative way, to then make reference to specific animals in the zoo. Ultimately, it is the program of the building, the spaces, the volumes inside the building that then inform the figures of the project. So that there is not a hiding of the program, but instead is an articulation of the program as components that make up the building itself. So the configuration of the interior can be complicit in the figuration of the exterior. So as the way that you arrange those volumes will then make implicit certain figures. So for example, in this art center that we did for China, the double height spaces of the studios in relationship to the circulation provides a certain agglomeration of volumes in the inside that then has an impact on the way that the building then manifests itself. And it brings into question what we call program. Is program the functions in the building, or is program the way that we conceive circulation within the building? In this case, because we needed a certain flexibility for the spaces and we were so limited for space, circulation oscillates in and out of the different volumes of the building. But ultimately, as you climb up the building, there is no need anymore for that zone of circulation, and the building caves in, leaning into itself. And that's what gives the building its unique image. Now, the configuration of a building also has to negotiate forces outside of it, like zoning, like height restrictions. So when we worked in this apartment complex in Boston, we were very much taken by the notion of connecting the dots between two very different height restrictions on the same site. On Dorchester Avenue, the buildings were required to maintain the height of the buildings along the street. On the back of the site, the building was allowed to go as high as 15 stories, overlooking the views of the city. That kind of zoning pressures on the exterior, or the capacity for us to understand that as an alibi for a figure for the building, then was in tension with the need for a particular grouping of unit types in the interior of the building. So the skin is the result of our desire to represent those different unit types in the exterior, while the overall effect is very much the result of the pressure from zoning. This kind of back and forth is, for me, almost present in every project. This, for me, is a great example, because we were designing this soccer stadium for St. Paul, Minneapolis. It's a project that went on hold, and we were just told it's actually not going to happen. They're going to do a baseball stadium instead, baseball field instead. So what was interesting in this case is that the pressure was even beyond the conventional zoning restrictions. We were in the landing path of the airport, and that very much limited the height of the building at a particular spot. That, combined with the unique presence of a hotel in the program, which force a certain height on the street, provided for us a very interesting push and pull between the guts of the building and its exterior, be it circulation, again, as a form of program, or be it the idea of retail in the ground level, always mediated by inventiveness in the way that we think of the skin of the building. So more recently, the political realities of a particular community have become very much the catalyst for certain formal manipulations in the way that I have been thinking of this library and cultural center for the city of Pompano Beach. The site is almost like any sort of French suburban site, that there is nothing around it. It's very open, almost with very little point of reference. But when you get to the, but when you explore the nitty-gritty of the community itself, a lot begins to be revealed. Pompano Beach is a community whose annual income is below the average in Florida. And in addition to that, it's extremely racially divided. The neighborhood on the east, where the existing library is located, in the center of which the existing library is located, is primarily Caucasian, whereas the neighborhoods to the west are primarily African American and a mix of Hispanic and African American. So what was remarkable about the project is that the library is to be moved from the center of the Caucasian neighborhood to the intersection between these three racially clear, between the racial lines. Now, normally, that context will not necessarily engender architectural form, I would argue. In this case, it produced a series of interesting formal consequences. We were very lucky that when we were asked to design the project, we were also asked to design the plaza in front of the building. So what you're looking at here is the master plan for the site, with a new plaza designed in collaboration with Shane Cohen, and then parking that we were able to locate behind the building, looking at a master plan that treats the library as a catalyst for more development on the site. So to our surprise, the head librarian for the Broward County Library System argued that the door of the building should be in the back for easy access to the parking. So originally, the project had been conceived as a two-story building with a library in the bottom and the cultural center on the top, and a single door with a lobby that gave access to both. And instead, we were confronted with the shock of the head of the Broward County Library System. He has 15 libraries under him, wanting us to put the door in the wrong side of the building. Now, I have to say, in all of my years of practice, I never, ever thought that I would be arguing for somebody not to put the door in the back of a building. I thought this was common sense. So the conversation then became, how could the library give its back to the community? Most of the users of the library do not drive to the library. Most of the users of the library use the public transit system. And by placing the door in the back, that will translate into the building, giving its back to the community. So the head of the Broward County Library System very nicely said, oh, we don't want to give our back to the community. However, we really need the door in the side of the parking. So the solution that we arrived at separated the two doors, the door from the cultural center and the door from the library, and created a breezeway that connects the back and the front of the building through the heart of the building. We also decided to eliminate this idea of the two pancakes and instead configure the cultural center so that it climbs on top of the library, and then configure the library so that it climbs on top of the cultural center. So it's almost two snakes that intertwine. So as a result, we placed the door of the cultural center in the corner that faces the plaza, and then we placed the door to the library, not in the back proper, I'm stubborn, but off of the breezeway, so that it's still in view from the front of the building, but really, in terms of distance, closer to the rear. So this had interesting formal consequences. It meant that the building could no longer be conceived as a whole that was stuffed, and instead it really was conceived as two bodies that intertwine. We placed the children's section of the library on the plaza itself, the most active part of the building during the day. And then for the cultural center, we placed the media center on the ground level, because this is what is used during the day. And then as you move to the second level, for the library, we place the reading room, the adult reading room, which is used mostly in the evenings and weekends. And then in the front, a black box theater that doubles as a multi-purpose space, which will be used mostly, again, on evenings or on weekends. So this created an interesting challenge for the development of the surfaces of the building. We did not want the building to appear empty in terms of the upper floors. And we wanted a building that took advantage of its evening occupation so that it could become a beacon to attract the public to the site. So we did a combination between storefront at the bottom, precast concrete panels on the top, but large sections that will be then frosted glass so that you don't see into the building and realize whether it's empty or not, but allow it to actually illuminate when activity happens at night. It was important for us that the building made no connection to the historicity of the site. Pompano is known for its Spanish-style architecture, but that architecture is very much tied to certain social groups and not others. So we struggle to actually draw from other kind of cultural references that are perhaps more pertinent to Florida. We were also interested in how to translate the flatness of the surface that we could afford. This is a very inexpensive building, which means then that the surfaces are extremely flat. How could we use different graphic devices as a way of creating the illusion of depth when there is actually none? So we work with the notion of scoring stucco, something really simple and something that you guys know a lot about, but also in projecting the mullions of the windows so that we could create, again, a certain optic that may give the illusion of the building being deeper and perhaps more three-dimensional than it really is. So our point of reference in the previous project really drew from things outside of architecture, but very much with the intent of architecturalizing them. In this project, we used a very similar technique. And perhaps stubbornly, we refused to rely on surface as the way to generate architectural effect. And instead, we work with the notion of volume, occupying the volume of the space as a way of producing architecture. This is an image from the film Metropolis. Many of you probably recognize it. And what is extraordinary about the image is that it really anticipated a whole body of architectural production about atriums. And it's interesting because all of the architectural imaginary that we have seen for 60 years in atriums is really embodied in the way that Metropolis internalize the outside world. You have, the elevator that has great views and produces dynamism within the space. You have trees that really show how this is really an exterior world internalized. And then the repetition of balconies, the relentless repetition of balconies that produces a certain vertiginous effect. This is the Hyatt Regency in Atlanta, and I have to say, I really, as a child and even until today, this is one of those moments in architecture that really excites me. The kind of the scale, the overwhelming scale of the space, and its unapologetic relationship to volume. I think it was a really interesting moment in architecture. And if you go today, I couldn't find a contemporary photo, but if you go today, these greens have actually grown much more and they dangle. And it's extremely powerful, the contrast between the vegetation of the space and the repetition of the cast in place concrete. But of course, I wouldn't be as lucky as to have Hyatt Regency. And instead, I was asked to intervene on an Embassy Suites in Lower Manhattan. Now, I don't know if you guys know Embassy Suites, but it's really a suburban brand. It's a suburban chain. They don't really do urban. So the materiality of the space is very much drywall. But you can see that even with the lack of architectural ambition, this notion of the outdoor and the landscape is very much present in the architecture. And the kind of repetition of the system. And there is also elevators that are open to the atrium that are behind us in the photograph. So I got it all. Now, what is interesting about the space is that because it's in Battery Park City, when it was built under the requirement that the ground level, the public level, the lobby, not be at the level of the street to prevent flooding. Instead, the lobby is actually elevated. So one of the first things we did was to create grand entrances, grand staircases at both ends to make it more accessible to the street. The other interesting feature of the space is the presence of a solid drawing that was applied to the volume of the multiplex program that the building was constructed with. So originally this was a hotel with conference center and multiplex behind it. And we were asked to maintain that program. This feature of the solid drawing and its volume really create an awkward relationship between the atrium and the balconies, between the mass and the balconies themselves. So when I interviewed for the project, my first instinct was to tell the client that perhaps we should paint it over. That did not go over very well. The client basically said no. But we got the project anyways. And I have to confess, I have grown to love the drawing. And I'm a little horrified that my original proposal was to get rid of it. Because it provides a certain power to the space that serves as a really interesting counterpoint for architecture. You can see from this drawing that we eliminated the base of the drawing. The drawing was uncomfortably sitting on a base that then had bamboo growing on it and covering the bottom of the painting. We freed the drawing, not the painting. We freed the drawing, and instead we gave it what I think are proper legs, which are these heavy pylons that visually allow the volume to sit comfortably in the space. The other thing that we did is that we opened up space underneath it, so that rather than having a very narrow passageway, the lobby now becomes a really spacious area where you can actually mingle and occupy it. So from the very beginning, during the interview process, we did a single proposal for the client. And from the very beginning, this presence of the drawing became really the central issue. It's what makes this atrium unique. Its presence is undeniable. So we became interested in the notion of unveiling, revealing, exposing. We knew that it couldn't be a conventional proscenium. We knew that it had to be a more three-dimensional approach to the notion of proscenium. And yet we understood that the painting needed to be mediated, the drawing needed to be mediated with the space around it. So the idea of veiling the drawing and in that way filling the space of the atrium, as opposed to demarcating boundaries within the space of the atrium, became the central idea of the project. A very strong point of reference is Diller-Scofidio's cloud project in Switzerland. This was a temporary installation, and I happened to be lucky enough to visit it. And the kind of effect that it produced, in my mind, really transgressed what we normally think of architecture. So I was interested in producing a similar effect, but in a permanent way. So as a result, we explore ways of producing this notion of veiling within the space by hanging a series of objects that then will create a completely different understanding of the space itself. And that will then create a dialogue with the solute. The geometry of the veils themselves is simply the result of reacting to the triangular element of the theaters, but also this terrible triangular bracing that holds the skin of the building. So we decided to veil that structure and then to carry those veils within the space itself. The bottom then became an opportunity for figuration and an opportunity to then have a dialogue with the solute drawing itself. This kind of intervention then became the catalyst for others within the building, as is the case of this staircase in the conference center adjacent to the atrium itself. Now, it was important for us in filling the space that we calibrated it very intentionally. We wanted the veils to maintain the monumentality of the space, but at the same time eliminate the notion of the scale, the vertiginous scale of the space. So we very carefully studied the possibility of making a plane by simply cutting the bottom of the veils with a certain geometry. So on the one hand, they open up towards the solute. On the other hand, they produce a ceiling, a cloud, that allows you to then mingle on the space in an intimate way. We had a similar approach for the upper frame. While we started with something really functional and flat, pretty quickly, the fact that you have to have a basket to carry men to clean the skylight became an alibi for figuring that upper frame. And what is interesting ultimately is not only that the Solduet partakes in a network of significant artworks in Battery Park City, but also that the architecture then begins to partake in the same conversation. See if I can do this. Thank you.